All right, John chapter 8, please.
Bill's just getting going.
All right, picking up where we left off last week. At verse 12. Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. The Pharisees therefore said to him, You bear witness of yourself. Your witness is not true. Jesus answered and said to them, Even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true. For I know where I come from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from and where I am going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. And yet if I do judge, my judgment is true. For I am not alone, but I am with the Father who sent me. It is also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true. I am one who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. Then they said to him, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. These words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come. Father, thank you again for an opportunity to be here with these beautiful people, to look into your word and just see all the beauty and grace and that's just coming out from every page, from every word. Lord, as we face the sadness of what's going on around us, I just ask for your strength and your grace to lift our spirits up. Let us keep our eyes focused on you and not on our surroundings, not on what's going on, but keep our eyes completely focused on you and what you're doing and being ready to move whenever it is you have us to go to the next thing. Love you so much. I just ask that you clear this room of any evil that's found its way in, and that your spirit would reign here. This is still your house where your people gather. So bless us with your presence. And all this I ask in the beautiful name of Jesus. Amen. Did you shut that heater off?
Yes.
So, our hero is in Jerusalem for the first time in a year and a half. He's come up to the holy city for the Feast of Tabernacles. While Jesus has made his way to Jerusalem quietly, almost in secret, his presence is anything but a secret now. Jesus enters the temple at the midway point of the festival and begins to teach, and almost immediately his enemies descend upon him. The entire gamut of the Jewish ruling elite are set on one thing: bringing down Jesus. The Pharisees, the scribes, and the high priests, who are from the Sadducean sect, are all plotting together to discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people, with the ultimate aim of making it easier for them to arrest and destroy him. Despite their efforts, Jesus' popularity continues to grow among the people. The religious leaders cannot compete with Jesus' doctrine, his doctrine which comes from God himself. The people, on the other hand, are divided. Who is this man? Who is this Jesus? No one is really talking openly for fear of reprisal from the Jewish leaders, but everywhere quiet debate is taking place. The question of the day is, who is this man? Opinions run the gamut. Some think Jesus to be a good man. Others think he is a deceiver and evil. Some think he is a prophet. Others say that's impossible. Still others think this man is the Messiah, and others claim that that too is impossible. But enough of the crowd is coming to believe that Jesus is the promised Messiah that the religious leaders are getting quite nervous, and they send officers to arrest him. The officers return to the chief priests and Pharisees, bewildered by Jesus' presence and awe of the words he speaks, and empty-handed. This angers the religious leaders greatly, but ultimately they realize they will not prevail against him that day and go home. Jesus spends the night on the Mount of Olives, returning at daybreak to the temple. The thousands of pilgrims in the city for the festival flock to him, so he sits down in the temple and begins to teach them. Shortly thereafter, a group of Pharisees and scribes break into the scene, dragging along with them a woman caught red-handed committing adultery. Setting her in the midst of the people, they remind Jesus that the law says that she should be stoned for what she has done, and then they ask him what should be done to her. The scene these men have staged is not about seeking justice under the law. If it was, they would have brought the man she was caught with them as well. The law states both parties committing adultery should be executed. No, this has nothing to do with law or justice. It's all about discrediting Jesus. These men think themselves clever. They think that they have Jesus over a barrel. If he says stone her, they can turn him over to the Romans for attempting to violate the Roman ban against the Jews carrying out capital punishment. If Jesus says to let her go, then they can accuse him before the people of not adhering to the law of Moses. These men foolishly think they have pushed Jesus into a corner he cannot get out of. The men have challenged Jesus to a battle of wits, and Jesus is about to show them that they have come unarmed. He's about to show them that they have arrived to a gunfight with a knife in their hands. His response to their query is remarkable. He says, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." An absolutely unimpeachable answer. It upholds the law, and yet sets the bar so high for anyone who wishes to condemn and execute this woman under it that no one can possibly meet it. So the men have, like scalded dogs, left with their tails between their legs. Which brings us to this week's passage, which picks up immediately after these men skulk back into the crowd. So, verse 12. Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Jesus had started teaching. He readdresses the people that he was teaching now that he's dealt with these other folks. Now this statement is enormous. It has legs that can run for days. But before we dig into what Jesus is saying here, I want to set up the backdrop. And this is awesome. Against which Jesus makes a statement. I teased a couple weeks ago that there were two statements that Jesus made in which the background of the Festival of Tabernacles and its ceremonies give the statement just that much more. It's just that much more awesome when you understand where and when Jesus said this. So, during the festival, two enormous, gigantic, and I actually read one commentary that said it was four, and some call it a candelabra and some call it, one place called it a chandelier, but this portion of the temple didn't have any ceiling, so I don't know how you get a chandelier in there, unless chandelier is a much broader term than I understand. But there's these really, really gigantic, I've heard as high as 10 stories tall, candelabras that set in the women's court, and candles or oil lamps all up and down them. And each night, the candelabras would be lit, and the brilliance was so amazing that it pretty much lit up the whole city. You could see it from everywhere. And this was symbolic of the pillar of fire which by night led the children of Israel in the wilderness when they dwelt in tabernacles and tents and booths. These were lit each night as the sun set, and the people would dance jubilantly throughout the temple courts by their light, praising God and celebrating his leading and provision. Tradition also tells us that on the last day of the feast, people would light torches and march around the temple, after which the torches would be placed along the walls of the temple. Now this symbolized Judaism and the temple in which they worship God as being a light to the Gentiles, and looked forward to the day when the Messiah would establish his kingdom with Jerusalem as basically the capital of the whole world. So where are we time-wise though? This is the day after the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. That was established in verse 37 of chapter 7, which stated that it was the last great day of the feast. And verse 53, as each man returned to his own home. So it's the day after the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. That day, while the feast lasts 7 days, that day, the 8th day, is a Sabbath. So everyone rests. No customary work can or shall be done. Now, verse 20 of this chapter tells us Jesus is in the treasury in the temple. Okay, this is a section of the temple where the pots are kept in which people could put in their offerings. These are the pots in which the widow placed her 2 mites into in Mark 12:42. Jesus was sitting and watching. And this treasury area is within the women's court of the temple. Now, the temple would be facing east, and then you'd have giant colonnades all the way around. So from the outside, you would see the top of the temple, and then the giant walls and colonnades and platforms where people could stand. And that was what you could come into from every side to get into the temple complex. And then your temple in the middle with the built out walled section, and then a huge courtyard all the way around it. Up in the northwest corner would be Antonia Fortress, and all this open courtyard would be the courtyard of the Gentiles. And then out from the temple, there would be walls built, which would close in at the end, and there'd be one gate in, and you had another wall. This first section was the women's section. Any Jew could get in there. That was the lowest level. Any Jew could get into the women's court, and that's why the pots for the offering were in there. And then after that is another shorter wall, and it created a section which was the men's court, and any Jewish male could go in there. And then there was a very short wall with, again, a single opening, and that was into the area right in front of the temple, and that was the priest court, and only the priest could go in there. That's where the brass altar would be, and the bronze laver for washing their hands and stuff and getting prepared to go do it. And then into the temple, the walled section, big doors, and you'd have the holy area, which is where the showbread and the incense altar would be, and the candelabra or the menorah, and then giant, huge, couple feet thick curtain, and then the Holy of Holies, which was one day a year one priest could go in with a. So Jesus is in the outermost court for Jews only, the same place where the candelabras were placed the night before, and just inside of where all of the torches had been placed the night before. So, it's the last day of the feast, Jesus in the temple, specifically in the women's court. This is where the gigantic candelabras are set up. The candles which were lit the evening before have all burned out by now. Surrounding the temple are the remnants of torches placed there the night before, which are now just charred sticks. All of these things have extinguished themselves overnight. So just close your eyes and you're in this court, and there's these giant candelabras and these burnout torches all the way around, giving off no light. here Jesus stands up and says, or raises his voice, because he's sitting down to teach, raises his voice and says, I am the light of the world. In the midst of this, Jesus, Sorry, I went a little off script and I just totally lost my place. Apologize. Now this, getting back to the statement itself, this is the second of 7 I am statements in John's Gospel. The first one being I am the bread of life, which we saw probably 2 months back. So what is I am the light of the world? Jesus as light to the world is actually how John opens his Gospel. In John 1 through 9, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. You don't realize how much light is in that opening until you read it, looking for the light. And there's a lot of light there. Now light is incredibly important to human beings. It's how we literally see and comprehend everything. Without light, our eyes are pretty much useless. Everything our eyes see, these receptors in the back of our eyes are simply reading the light waves and how they bounce off of things. Without light, our eyes are literally useless. Without light, we have no depth perception. Without light, there's no color. Color only exists because of how light bounces off a particular object and then hits the back of our eyes. Without light, we stumble over things. Without light, we can easily misidentify any object we come in contact with. Jesus obviously is not now actual visible light to us. He did go atop the Mount of Transfiguration, and someday Revelation tells us that he will be actual light in the New Jerusalem. There will be no lamps nor sun sun. We will see everything by the light emanating from Jesus. But for now, Jesus is spiritual light. It's against his perfect example that we can see and can truly judge what is evil and what is good. There's a whole lot out in the world that looks good that's actually evil, and you don't see it until you put it up against Jesus. And then suddenly, oh yeah, that's really not all that good at all. Without the spiritual light of Jesus, we cannot see God. The light of Jesus quite literally changes the way we see everything. Any of you guys, do you watch any of those crime shows? Like NCIS or Law and Order, where they do forensic analysis. They come on a crime scene and they're sure something nefarious has gone down in this room, but they can't see anything. So they turn off all the lights and they bring in what's called an alternate light source, an ALS, and then they put on some fancy goggles, and suddenly with this black light or infrared light, the whole place is just a bloody mess. You had no idea. You had no idea what was hidden. Body fluids, and you can see all kinds of things with this alternate light source. If you get a piece of paper that's been written on, they find these old documents. And in the old days, they wrote on skins, and there's only so many animals to kill. And so if you needed a new parchment and you didn't have an animal to kill, and then it takes a while to prepare it, so you just scrape off the old stuff. Well, they're taking alternate light sources and looking at it and reading what was written before, what is actually on it now. And spiritually speaking, Jesus is our alternate light source. Because by him we see things that we had no idea existed. While this statement, I am the light of the world, is a statement which shows us the makeup and character of Jesus, it's also a statement of deity. I am is the ancient sacred name God took for himself when Moses asked God, "Who shall I tell them sent me?" And God replied, "Tell them I am sent you." Jesus' statement shows he's aware of his surroundings, where he's at, what he's doing, and is using the imagery of his surroundings to make his words take on a greater depth and meaning. You think you know what all this means. I am the light of the world. The torch lighting ceremony of the night before is evoked specifically here. Jesus does not say he is the light of Israel. He does not say he's the light of the Jews. He says he is the light of the whole world. That torch lighting ceremony was all about Judaism being in the temple, being the light of the whole world. That it would, Gentiles would express God, and Jesus is like, no, I am. But this is also a claim to the Messiahship. It evokes very specific prophecy from Isaiah 42:6. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles. Jesus follows that with, he who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. The candelabras symbolized God leading the children of Israel in the wilderness with a pillar of fire by night. No matter where God led them, they never walked in darkness. They always had light to see. Jesus says, following me will be just like that. In so many words, Jesus is saying it's not Judaism, it's not the temple that will be light to the whole world. It is not this place or your region that you should look to for guidance. Those pictures in your ceremony, those pictures from the Old Testament, they are pictures of me. Look to me, I am the light, and I will guide you to true life, eternal life, in the presence of God and the holy angels. We could spend all day on this, but for sake of time, we're moving on. Verse 13. And the Pharisees therefore said to him, "You bear witness of yourself, your witness is not true." So in direct response to what Jesus just said about himself, the Pharisees say basically, you're a liar. And to do this, they're invoking a concept in Jewish law that says that you need at least 2 witnesses to establish a factual basis for anything. Now, the Pharisees could not prove that Jesus is not who he claimed to be, so they decide to change the argument to you can't prove what you are saying. You have no witnesses to back you up. No one else of any authority says this about you. You cannot prove that you are the Messiah and God. You can't prove it. Which is kind of the whole opposite of, prove you're innocent. They're accusing him of something, Anyway, it's not about the law. It's about embarrassing Jesus. This does tell us that they get what Jesus is saying. They understand the claim he is making. They simply don't believe it. They simply can't see it. The light is there. It's shining before them. They can't see it because they're blind to it. It doesn't matter how much light there is if your eyes are closed or they just don't work or you don't have them. You're not going to see anything. Yeah. Verse 14, Jesus answered and said to them, even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true. For I know where I came from and where I am going, but you do not know where I come from and where I am going. So Jesus' response does not actually start out by addressing their objection. He doesn't go right in against, it's not a direct answer to the argument. He does not immediately say, but I do have witnesses. He says your concept of what establishes truth does not apply to me. I, unlike you, can bear witness of myself, and my witness is true. I know who I am. I am God. I know exactly who I am. If you actually knew who I was, we would not even be having this conversation. Jesus is God in the flesh. Who can truly bear witness of God and his nature except God? No one knows God truly except God. Even the devil doesn't know God as well as God because the devil still thinks he can defeat God. Think about it. The only one who can truly bear witness of God is God. Now, Jesus has done this before. This is not the first time Jesus has made this argument. In fact, the last time he was in Jerusalem, he made pretty much the exact same argument. He's confronted by the Jews over healing the man at the pool of Bethesda on the Sabbath. And they confront him, and Jesus responded the same way. John 5:16 and 17. For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. Jesus' response is identical. That law does not apply to me because I am God. Anybody who says Jesus never claimed to be God is simply not paying attention. I don't think they've ever read this book because repeatedly he makes it clear that he is God. Verse 15. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. So, here is why you cannot discern who I am. Because you are fleshly. These men are only concerned with what's natural. They have no mind or heart for the spiritual. And I gotta wonder if this isn't, a result of legalism. When you think you can earn your way into heaven, when you think you can put God in your debt by doing good things, you have no need for the supernatural. You have no need for the spiritual because you're the master of your domain. You don't need any help. You don't need any grace. You don't need any mercy because you are earning your way into heaven. So I wonder if a lot of these men's problem, their inability to even connect with the spiritual, is a result of this legalism that says, I can do it. Which is pride, which is idolatry, actually. So, Jesus then says, I judge no one. And I think this statement says at least two things. One, I think this is a shot at them because they are so judgmental. And not in the fact of being discerning, but judgment in the vein of condemnation. They're just so quick to constantly condemn people. They had just wanted to condemn this woman for a sin that many of them were guilty of, and now they want to condemn Jesus for saying things that they don't like and they don't agree with. So I think on one level it's a shot at the fact that they are so judgmental or condemning. And two, it's a statement of what he's not here to do at this time. And I go back to John 3:17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. In this first coming of Jesus, he's here to save. Thank God for that. The second coming is going to be a completely different story. In fact, that appearance of Jesus will be all about judgment. Completely about judgment. But the awesome thing about God is that he does not come to judge before he makes a way to completely avoid judgment.
Yeah.
It's nice that way.
That's awesome. That's good news, people. Judgment. Don't have to face it. Verse 16. And yet if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone, but I am with the Father who sent me. So Jesus did not come to judge, but if he chose to, he could. And it would not just be his judgment alone, but the judgment of God the Father, who is always with him. Jesus had every right to come at any time he desired and render judgment to every man for their works of evil. And we've all got him. At any time he could have showed up. At any time he could have gone, you know, and I'm tired of this. I'm starting over, you know, or I'm not going to do anything because, you know, we got a great thing going on here and these guys are just wrecking it. At any time, God was perfectly justified to come back and go, and he didn't. Jesus' first appearance is a wonderful and amazing act of grace. Verse 17 and 18. It is also written in your law that the testimony of two men is true. I am one who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. So Jesus did not address the Pharisees' point of order at first. He first made the point that their premise of needing two witnesses doesn't apply to me. But this obviously was the more vital point in Jesus' eyes. But nonetheless, to satisfy them, he points out that there are actually, in fact, two witnesses. Adam Clark, a Bible commentator, said this, and I didn't think I could improve on it. So our Lord speaks here exactly in the character of an ambassador. Such a person does not bring a second with him to vouch for his truth. His credentials from his king ascertain his character. He represents the king's person. So our Lord represents the Father as bearing witness of him. If I wasn't worthy, he wouldn't have sent me. Therefore, he bears witness of me by the fact that he sent me. So by the mere fact that Jesus is an ambassador, a sent representative of God the Father, Jesus' validity is implied. But there are other ways God the Father has testified of Jesus. Audibly at Jesus' baptism, audibly on the Mount of Transfiguration, and also by the works that Jesus does. These are things that only God can do. These are things that the prophets said the Messiah would do by the power of God. Only God can command demons. They have to listen to him. Only God can give sight to the blind. Only God can cause the lame to walk. Only God can raise the dead. Two already. Only God can restore speech to the dumb. Only God can command the winds and seas and they obey. The fact that Jesus can do all these things seemingly at will is a resounding endorsement from God the Father that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. Verse 19, then they said to him, where is your Father? Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my Father. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. Where is your Father? Almost all commentators that I looked at believe that this question by the Pharisees is a shot. It's an insult at the mystery surrounding Jesus' parentage. That this question is as much or perhaps more an insult than it is a genuine inquiry as to where your Father was. The Pharisees had done enough digging to know about the rumors of impropriety concerning Jesus' conception. And later they're going to make a more direct accusation, basically calling Jesus a bastard. Here they're a little more subtle about it. They listened to rumors and innuendo, which is such a pity. Had they done just a little more research, they would have seen that Jesus was the Son of God, a life formed in the womb of Mary, his mother, and that his life fulfilled all that the prophets said about him. Everything. They only listened to what they wanted to hear. They only listened to hear what would fit what they wanted to believe. This question also shows that these men are not even in the same chapter, let alone on the same page of the same book as Jesus. Everything Jesus is saying is spiritual in nature, and these men are completely stuck in the natural. Their responses, accusations, and questions prove it. Jesus is talking about God the Father and things that are spiritually discerned, while these men are quibbling over points of the law and heredity. These men cannot see Jesus because their eyes are firmly fixed on the earth. They cannot seem to raise their heads for even a moment to look up to the heavens. Jesus here goes to the heart of their blindness, the core of why they cannot see his light. They do not recognize Jesus for who he is because they don't know the one who sent him. How can you possibly hope to see God if you will not turn your gaze away from the things of this world? You cannot see spiritual truth if you will not look away from the things of the flesh. And there's a concept under Jesus' words that I think is really, really important to know. There's an unspoken truth implicit in Jesus' statement. In fact, it runs under most of what Jesus has said to the Pharisees this day. Implicit in Jesus' words is the fact that God has revealed more than enough of himself to his people, the children of Israel, that they should recognize Jesus as being from him. Jesus is saying that had you really read, had some understanding of, and believed all that God the Father has revealed of himself in his word, and what he's revealed of himself in the Jewish Holy Scriptures, then you would have known me the minute you heard me speak or saw the works that I do. The Jewish Holy Scriptures, what we today call the Old Testament, is not a dead book. It's as valid to understanding what the New Testament tells us as the words of Jesus are. In fact, to fully understand the beauty, magnificence, and depth of who Jesus is and what his life, death, burial, and resurrection accomplished, we need to study the whole counsel of God. His word from the beginning to the end, all of it. All these times, twice in just the passages we've read over the few weeks, Jesus sat down to teach. What was he teaching? He was teaching about God and revealing himself from what we call the Old Testament. If Jesus taught about God and himself from the Old Testament, I think we would be wise indeed to spend time plumbing its depths as well. I know I've made this point before, and I will make it again, because Jesus makes it himself so many times. Sometimes directly and other times subtly, Jesus makes the point that we need the whole counsel of God, the entire book, from start to finish. God's revelation of himself and his divine plan of redemption, and therefore his revelation of Jesus Christ, begins in Genesis, not Matthew. The Old Testament is the story, and the New Testament, as Paul Harvey used to say, is the rest of the story. Verse 20. These words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come. So we saw earlier how this verse helped us set up the scene in which this exchange takes place, and the depth and beauty it added to the event detailed here. But as it stands, this verse tells us something else. Where it stands, where it says Jesus is alone. His disciples are not with him. We established that a couple weeks ago. And he's physically vulnerable, teaching and contending with his enemies in the treasury section of the women's court of the temple. In a natural sense here, there is absolutely nothing to prevent the religious authorities from laying hands on him and taking him into custody right here, right now, this very minute. The authorities sought to take Jesus in chapter 7, verse 30, and when officers were sent with orders to arrest him in 7:32, and yet here he is the next day, and no one has yet to lay a hand on him. Jesus is surrounded by the enemies of God, and he is trapped. They need only cover one entryway to keep Jesus from escaping from the temple. And yet, his enemies are impotent to move against him. They have the desire to take him. They desire to silence him by taking his life, but they can do nothing to act on that desire. Awesome statement, but why is it here? It's almost an aside if you look at the flow, where we'll go next week. It really actually disrupts the flow of conversation. It's almost as if the writer, John the Beloved, is suddenly, in the middle of his writing, overcome with awe by the fact that Jesus, despite the danger, stands firm in the face of it and continues to speak God's truth. And that would be a wonderful and valid observation to make. Awesome. But it also makes another more important point. Whether John the writer was aware of it or not, I know the true author of the book is fully aware of the point it makes. And that is why he prompted John to inject this observation at this point in the narrative. He could have put this at the end. He could have. This observation proves Jesus' point. This shows that Jesus, all that Jesus has said about his identity is absolutely true. How does that work, Carl?
Absolutely true.
Jesus is physically vulnerable, trapped, and surrounded by his enemies. Why has he not been taken into custody? The only explanation is that Jesus is the chosen vessel of God the Father, who will not allow his representative to be taken even 1 second before he intends him to be. If Jesus was not who he claimed to be, if he was not sent by and protected by God the Father, he would be dead already. The ground would already be stained with his blood if he were not the anointed messenger of God the Father Almighty. There's literally no other rational explanation for it. And that's why it's there. Because it proves Jesus' point. So how do we wrap up this week? I had planned to go much further, but this is as far as I was allowed to get. So, kind of as a wrap up tonight, I'm just going to ask a rhetorical question. Why are you here tonight? I sincerely hope that you are here hoping to see God, to get a glimpse of Him, for your vision of Him to just become that much clearer. To see God. For our eyes, the eyes of our heart, to see God, we need spiritual light. Jesus is that light. To know Jesus is to know God. And you might say, wait a minute, Carl. You just made the point of telling us how God revealed Himself in the Old Testament and that we can know Him by studying that along with the New Testament. Now you're saying to know Jesus is to know God. And you would be correct. But perhaps I haven't explained it properly. Or I left something out. And let me clear that up. The way God best expressed the essence of who He is by constantly pointing to the time when He would enter human history as one of us, when God Himself would break into the world as the God-man, Jesus Christ. There is no greater expression of who God is than Jesus, so much so that the entire Old Testament pointed to Him. Jesus is the exact image of God. 2 Corinthians 4, 3-6. But even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. Skip to verse 6. For it is the God who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the exact image of God. What has God told us about Himself? He told us this when He appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai in Exodus 34, 5-8. Now the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of Yahweh. And Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. This is what God said of Himself. And nowhere are these self-proclaimed attributes of God more vividly portrayed than when He Himself entered the world and lived as one of us, died in our place, was buried, and rose triumphantly in the person of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. The whole book, from Genesis to Revelation, is a revealing of God in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the spiritual light by which we can see God. And we can see Jesus in every book, chapter, verse, and sentence of the Bible. Seek God and know Him by seeking the incarnation. God the Son, Jesus Christ, the light of the world.